All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've got Pamela Koch on the line. And Pam, I hope I am pronouncing your last name right this time.
You are?
All right. We are getting archived, and we're going to get the webinar underway. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I'd like to let everybody know what the webinar is going to look and feel and listen look and feel like, and how it's going to go for the next hour. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to have Pam give a talk and show some slides and run through the webinar. And it's a great webinar on food system and sustainability. And then at the end of that presentation, Pam's going to take some questions for about 30 minutes. At the very end, we are going to ask everybody to fill out a short evaluation of the webinar so we can make these webinars work a little better. We're always looking to make them better, although we always have some great presenters like Pam, and so far they've been really successful here at Green Teacher. And as a thank you for answering some questions at the end of the webinar and filling out that evaluation, you'll be eligible to win a free one-year digital subscription to Green Teacher, our nonprofit magazine for youth educators. But if you have a question or some feedback to give us, also feel free to do so throughout the presentation. We've got a chat box that you'll find in the bottom left corner of the screen. You'll see a section that says Main Room, where you can type in any questions you have, or if you just want to sort of discuss things with the other webinar participants. Perhaps people would like to tell us where they're from and get the discussion started in that chat box. So the first thing I'd like to do, and I'm just going to advance the slide, which I can't do while I'm talking. I have to sort of do double duty here because usually we have the presenter advance the slides, so I've got to do a couple of things at once here. So I'd like to tell you about Green Teacher. We've published a number of books over the years with environmental education ideas. These books are comprised of articles that once appeared in our quarterly magazine and rewritten for the books. So Green Teacher, as an unprofitable nonprofit, very much appreciates your feedback and very much appreciates that if you find tonight's webinar useful, to consider purchasing a subscription to our magazine or purchasing one of our books. That helps us enable to keep these webinars that you're enjoying tonight for free. Sorry, I apologize for this being so choppy, but I'll just advance to a slide that shows you a little bit about our magazine. Green Teacher magazine has been published for 20 years, publishing innovative articles, activities, and lesson plans developed by environmental educators inside and outside of K-12 classrooms. And as you heard moments ago, this presentation is being archived, and as I said before the presentation started, so non-subscribers will be able to view this webinar for the next month. So don't feel compelled to take notes during the webinar necessarily, though some people like to, because if you want to know some of the details, if you think you missed something at the end of the presentation, you can go into the archive and go through it all again. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter tonight, Pam Koch.
Oh, is this for me to start?
Sorry, Pam, I'm being a little choppy. I do want to give a brief bio of you. You are, and I have to bring it up on my screen. I'm trying to do too many things at once. And this is also the first time I've hosted a webinar. So if you want to introduce yourself and get things going,
Sure,
feel free. It might be a little easier to do it that way.
Okay. And I apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties when I did the practice in the WIMBA classroom. I got in no problem. For whatever reason, my computer seems to be working fine, except for loading that at the moment. Anyway, my name is, as has been said, is Pam Koch, and I work at Teachers College, Columbia University at the Center for Food and Environment and do a lot of curriculum development on food system sustainability. And I hope I'll be able to share some of that background with you and some of the things that I have done and to be able to give you some ideas for how to connect food and sustainability. So if, Brandon, you could go to the next slide, which says, slide 2, which says today's session on the top. So we are going to talk about connecting food to sustainability, a little bit about doing food system education, some curriculum ideas, ways to get involved in the movement, and then have some questions and discussion. If you go to slide 3, this is a book called Limits to Growth. And Limits to Growth is a book that came out about 40 years ago that it was really about we are going to be hitting some limits to what our planet can handle. And probably many of you are familiar with that book. If you go to the next slide, Brandon. This is actually an investigation that came out in Science and Nature that now that we are 40 years into this, how are we projecting? And if you look at these lines on here, it shows that we are actually following the projections that were put forth as the most likely projections that were going to be the future by Limits to Growth pretty closely. If you see how these solid lines are following those dotted lines. And if you look, our food per capita has been going up. Actually, we're a little bit above that now, which is great, but it is projected to go down in the future. So we really do need to take care of our planet so that we will be able to keep producing food in the future. And Brandon, if you go to the next slide that says food-based education. So we think about really teaching children about food in all different aspects. And if you go to the next slide, that can include everything about food, which is gardening, cooking instruction, and then what we call investigating food systems, which is really trying to discover all the parts of our food system and how they all work together. And we believe that, going to the next slide, that when you do this kind of education, you are helping to make connections for children so that they can actually participate in scientific debates about how our food system works. So if you go to the next slide, today's children are tomorrow's adults who will have to be making a lot of tough decisions about our natural environment and about food. So we believe that educating them about that can make a big difference. And if you go to the next slide, then they can make choices that will take care of both themselves and the natural environment.
Sorry, Pam,
Going to the next slide.
Pam, can I interrupt you for just 1 second? I'm having some trouble with the slides here. They're not coming up in the way that you want. Hold on, I'm trying to get that fixed. Hold on for just one. So I guess you can keep on talking, but just so you know.
Okay. You know what?
Brandon, excuse me. I'll interrupt you both, Brandon and Pam. It's Tim Grant. I'll advance the slides, Brandon. It'll be easier, I think.
Okay, we are right now on slide 10. So we, as we are getting to that, basically we really use science as the foundation for how we have studied food, and we really believe that that makes a lot of interdisciplinary connections so that students can use what they've learned in their everyday acts to become citizens who can make choices for the future. So if, Tim, you could get to slide 14. That says Linking Food and the Environment, an Inquiry-Based Science and Nutrition Program. This is the curriculum that I have developed along with some colleagues over the past about a little over 10 years. And I just want to share with you a little bit about some of the things that we thought about as we were developing a curriculum that was to teach students about food systems. And what we really tried to think about is what is the process that we want students to go through as they are learning this, and then what are some key content questions that we really thought it was worth the students looking into. Are you up to that slide, Tim?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so if you could advance to slide 15. So this was really a connection between nutrition and science education. So if you look at the person on the top two people that are on there, the person on the left is Dr. Isabel Contento, who was from nutrition education and is a behavioral nutritionist. So she really tries to help people change their food choices. And then the person on the right is Dr. Angela Calabrese-Barton, who is a science educator. And she was all about how can we get students excited, interested in science, understanding science, doing inquiry-based science investigation. So to try to make this marriage, that was something that both did the science education and also really did have the students basically learn the skills that they needed to make different food choices that would support what they were learning, really was a marriage of us coming together and doing this. And it has developed into the 3 volumes that are on the bottom, and I'm going to talk mostly about, all about actually the first 2, Growing Food and Farm to Table and Beyond. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science process that we came to. And if you click to the next slide, we did this because how students learn is as important as what they learn. So go to the next slide. We came up with a learning cycle that we call Questa, and this takes students through the learning process. And you could do this with anything that you're learning, and we found that it really works really nicely to get students to think through a topic deeply, kind of from beginning to end. So the first thing that students do is they question, and you can see some of the things they do when they question there. This is up to slide 19, Tim. And then next slide, next they experiment. So this really is doing basic scientific processes where they're designing experiments, collecting data, analyzing those data, and using them. And then next slide, next we have found that then after they have done those hands-on activities and they have really learned about how to do something, then we want to show them that there really is a lot more that is known about the topic. So we have them do searching, which is really researching, so they can discover more about it. And that might be reading books, talking to people, searching on the internet, or some other way that they can learn what else has been known about the topic. And then going to the next slide, the fourth part of it is theorizing. And we really think that this is the most important part, and sometimes the part that if we especially are rushing when we're doing education, that we don't make the time to do. But this is where we actually have the students analyze things, create their own ideas. So they are coming with up with their own ideas of how things actually work. And this is where then we believe they will be able to take the information, and if you go to the next slide, and have it in their minds enough that they will be able to apply it to their everyday lives. So, I always think as a researcher, if I could do the most perfect research, I would be able to, watch the students as they are making some food choices somewhere and being able to know what was going on in their minds, the types of things that they're thinking about, and then by the end, I would hope that they are thinking about lots more of the things that we are teaching them about. So, for example, they would be thinking about things, where might this food have come from, or how far did it travel to get to me, or what were how was it processed, or what kind of market am I supporting by buying this, or what were the natural resources used to make the packaging, in addition to things that might be about the healthfulness of the food, but that they would be actually having all of that in their minds because of going through this process of first questioning, then doing some hands-on experiments, searching for more information, synthesizing it all in their minds by theorizing and being able to apply it. So then the next slide, all of these phases are dynamic. I went through them in order, but really as students go through them, they will go through in that order, but they will actually often jump around and go from different phases along the way. In addition, in our curriculum, as you go from the beginning of a series of lessons, you're going to be actually having lots more questioning, and you might go through the cycle several times during something as you go through different topics, but probably by and large, at the beginning, you'll be doing a lot more of questioning and experimenting, and by the end, you'll be doing a lot more of the synthesizing and applying. Now go to the next slide, which is framing the content. So then we really tried to think about what it is that we wanted to do to basically have the curriculum tell a story that unfolded and made sense to the students. And sometimes this can really feel like a chicken and egg thing, that you want them to know everything at the beginning, but you realize that they don't know anything yet. And so how do you end up picking and choosing what order to do things that makes it unfold in a way that really makes sense to the students? So if you go to the next slide, what we have tried to do is create driving questions. So basically to think about a key inquiry-based question that is what the students are trying to learn about, the whole time that they are doing the investigations. And then we have the investigations, and you can see they should be thoughtful, relevant, and worthwhile, and they should motivate them to be scientists. And from all of that, we think that then that pulls it together enough that the students will be able to change what they think, feel, and do. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the types of things that we decided to put in the curriculum, and that's the next slide. We're on slide 27. And the next slide is the cover of the growing food module. So for this whole thing, what we really wanted to do is have children learn about how our food is produced. So if you go to the next slide, the key question that we really thought was most important for students to learn was, how does nature provide us with food? And in this question, it is something that most students, and this is geared towards upper elementary students, and we've had teachers adapt it to younger learners and older learners as well, but it is something that most children would really know something about, but they might not know a lot of the details about it. So we will have them think about this question at the beginning. We'll have them answer the question in writing, draw a picture that represents the answer to this question for them, and then as they move through the curriculum, they end up exploring how important plants are and realize the very important role that plants play as the foundation of being able to produce our food. They learn about the process of photosynthesis and how that works. Then they learn that we have lots of interactions in nature. So now they're layering on more pieces of information so that their answer to this question of how does nature provide us with food can get richer and richer as they move along. So they explore how we have producers that are plants and then consumers and decomposers that break things down, and how in nature all of these basically interact together and everything ends up getting recycled and reused in nature. Then we move on and we say, okay, how do we produce the foods that we want to eat? And they realize that we then end up working with, and maybe sometimes not so much with, nature system in order to produce the specific plants and animals we need, and how can we make sure that we are working with nature in order to do this. And then by the end, we end up talking to them more about what kinds of things, now that they understand this food production system better, what kinds of things do they want to be thinking about when they are making their own food choices, so that they can actually then get to the end of our Questa cycle and apply what they have learned to their lives. If you go to the next slide, Tim. This is the cover of the Farm to Table and Beyond book. And for this one, going to the next slide, the key question that we have is, what is the system that gets food from farm to table? And that's the first half. And so that is really where we explore what are all the parts of the food system that we actually interact together to get us our food. So we have to grow and produce our food, and then typically we're not eating the food right where it's grown, so then we have to get it wherever we need to get it. So there's transportation involved in our food system. Sometimes for some foods it might travel very far. There might also be many different times that it is transported through the process, and then we might actually preserve the food to make it last longer in some way, and we can do that with some physical methods of preserving the food, or some adding something to the foods, and what are the consequences of all of those methods? Why do we need to do it? How do we change food along the way, and are we changing it in a way that's just making it more edible? Are we altering the food? Are we adding more ingredients to it? What kinds of things are we adding to it? What are we having done away from us that we don't see, such as in places like factories? What are we doing ourselves to change our food? What are the resources used to package our food? And all of that. Then the second part of this question is, how does the system affect the natural environment? So then they go back through all these parts of the food system and they think about them more deeply to figure out how they end up impacting the environment. So if you go to the next slide, Tim. An activity that we have done that has worked really well to introduce food systems to children is to make food system maps. So Tim, if you go to the next slide, that should have corn, and you can pick any food in the upper left-hand corner. And then if you click to the next slide, Tim, that should put a can of canned corn on the bottom. And so what you would do is, obviously, corn on the cob to canned corn isn't changed that much. You would have students try to use words, arrows, and pictures to try to describe all the steps that they think would have to happen to get this food from how it was on the farm to how it is in the store, so in the can in this case. And it really gets them thinking about things. This activity, if you go to the next slide, that then puts a corn sweetened cereal down there. Obviously, if you do it like this is a little bit more complicated than the can of corn because now there's actually a lot of other ingredients added to it and a lot more had to happen to it. The corn sweetened cereal looks obviously much more different than the corn looked, whereas the canned corn looks more similar. You could, if you go to the next slide, you could also do it for something like orange to orange soda, and they would pretty much discover along the way that there isn't much orange or none orange in the orange soda. But this really can get students thinking a lot about all the different parts of the system in their own way and add on to it as they're going along. We've also done this at the beginning and then kept them out and had students add more things to them or redo it as time goes on as they're developing a greater understanding of our food system. And if you click to the next slide, then you can actually go through this and you can check for some things that I talked about before that are the parts of the system. So you could talk about the growing is in parentheses there. You could talk about all the different processes, what had to happen to actually grow the food, or you could start with the food grown and just talk about what happens after it leaves the farm until it would get to us. And then the other things that are here, transporting, processing, packaging, and waste. Then if you click to the next slide, what you can also do, and I like to actually do this with giving the students different color Post-its, is you could then have them think about the impacts that all of the parts of the system have. And so what are the positive and negative impacts for these different steps that they're drawing along the way on the natural environment, on our personal health, so is what they're doing to the food, is it making it more healthy or less healthy? And then what are the social or ethical consequences of this and what's going along the way. Another thing that you can do with this as well is you could talk about what might happen that would break down the system at different steps. So for example, if you were having problems and the trucks weren't coming in to take the food, then the part of the system that was actually transporting the food from one point to another would end up breaking down. So the food, if it didn't stop coming in, the food would end up building up in that part of the system. So you can really help them understand how the different parts of the system interact with each other. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about another curriculum that we developed that is for Food Day. So if you click to the next slide, Food Day is October 24th, and this curriculum, if you go to foodday.org, you can get to it on the website. So I'd like to show you a little bit about that. The first lesson is about eating real, and so the message is to eat more whole foods. And I just want to show you some of the charts that are used in that lesson so that you could take them, since you could get them off the web, and use them in what you are doing. So these are called food change cards, and Tim, there's going to be lots of clicking at this point. So we start out with foods that are in their whole forms, and if you click to the next slide, you should see corn on the cob. That is basically healthy for us. And if you click to the next slide, we have grilled chicken that is healthy for us, and it's obviously not exactly how it came off the chicken, so that's why there's a little bit of a red graph there that says that it was processed a little bit. If you click to the next slide, you can see our orange is right from how it came from nature and is quite healthy for us. Milk is healthy and is just processed a little bit, basically to pasteurize and homogenize it, which we have to do here to make sure that it's safe. And we have brown rice, which has just had the most outer layer removed, but the whole rest of the kernel is there. So then if you click to the next slide, we can take all of these whole foods and we can change them in a small way. And so if you look here, we can take the corn on the cob in the same photo that we had before to have the canned corn, and the processing goes up some. We had to put it in a can, so we had to add some resources for the packaging. So the red bar goes up a little bit and the green bar goes down a little as we move from there. Then for the chicken, we can take the grilled chicken and we can make fried chicken, and then we've added a coating onto it, we've added other things to it, and so the processing has gone up some. And then if you go to the next slide, we can take orange and we can squeeze them and make them into orange juice. That changes it a little bit. And finally, we can, two more, so we can take the milk and we can make it into fruit-flavored yogurt, which also processes it, and we can take the rice and turn it into white rice by removing the outer bran, and that has changed it a little bit. then we can take these whole foods and we can actually change them a lot. So if you click here to the next slide, then that corn becomes the corn sweetened cereal that we just showed before. So that is changed a lot, and the processing has gone way up, and the healthfulness has gone way down. And if you click to the next slide, the chicken you can change into chicken nuggets, which definitely has lots of other ingredients added and has been changed a lot. Obviously, all of these, as they're moving along, are changing the healthfulness of the food and also changing the ecological impact of them, because there's many more resources that are used to get all the ingredients there, to do the processing, to package the food. If it's something that needs to stay cold or frozen, such as once you make something into chicken nuggets, it have to stay frozen the whole time, and you can talk about all those factors. You can take the orange and change it into orange juice, which is, orange soda, which has changed a lot, and the milk and turn it into American processed cheese food, which has changed a lot, and the rice and turn it into rice cereal treats. So if we look at going to the next slide, look at all of these all together, you can see that when we eat foods that are more right how they come from nature, things that are real foods, then they are much more healthy. And as you move across, you can see the green bars go down and the red bars go up. So you can use this as a way to start discussion. If you click to the next slide, as I said at the beginning, what we tried to do was really bring together how to marry doing inquiry-based science investigations about these food system issues, along with them making it practical that people would change their behavior. So this is one of the action plans that goes with doing that activity in the food day lesson. So students would realize that they are going to eat a real food instead of a more overly processed food, so an apple instead of a fruit roll-up, and when they would do it during the day and what days of the week. So if you go to the next slide, that's the Eat Real lesson. Then just to show you the other themes, the next one is mostly plants, and then the next one is not too much, so not eating too much of overly processed foods, and basically when they're having snacks and chips and stuff like that, to have small sizes and to learn the health implications and the environmental implications of that. Some of you might be familiar with Michael Pollan's book, In Defense of Food, and these themes definitely came from there. He was actually very involved in creating the Food Day movement as well. Then the next theme is, going to the next slide, is navigate the environment. So find the healthy foods that are available in the environment around you and be an advocate for change. Also on the Food Day website, if you're interested in your students going to the next slide, taking a quiz that they would end up learning about how to eat real. And if you go to the next slide, another way to connect is to understand the implications that our food system is having on the earth. And so for older students, if you haven't read Bill McKibben's Earth book, I would highly recommend it. And some of you, going to the next slide, might have read his article that was in Rolling Stone over the summer about global warming's terrifying new math, that basically shows how much fossil fuel is still in reserve and how much the gas companies are planning on actually taking out of the earth, and what that would end up doing to the temperature. He is then building onto this a tour that's going on now called Do the Math, and going around the United States to talk about this. So if you're someplace, you could click on this website and figure out if it will be anywhere near where you are. And finally, this magazine is actually from the middle school where my son happens to be going now. He just started this year, but the teacher made it last year. So this just gives you another idea. She taught the students all about food system and sustainability, and then she used actually an online program to help them create this magazine where they all got to write articles about what they learned, called Youth Voices on Food and Sustainability. So that was the way that she synthesized and integrated together what she learned. Thank you. And now I would be delighted to have a discussion and take questions. And just to remind everybody, I can't see what's coming up on the screen, so I guess you guys can fill me in.
All right, Pam, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. And what's on the screen right now is an area for everybody who has been listening and watching to submit some questions for Pam about the presentation and about anything that maybe you were wondering about that you don't feel Pam covered in the presentation, although I do think that was pretty exhaustive. And I think I'm getting some questions in now, so let me try to pull those up. and we can get things going. I'll ask Pam actually a quick question, just to get the ball rolling here. Here we go. And Pam, I was wondering if you could discuss some ways to connect classroom sort of general curriculum experiences with food experiences.
Mm-hmm. You mean like gardening and cooking experiences?
Yeah, like classroom curriculum experiences to school garden or cooking.
Oh, okay.
Or I guess
Sure. So definitely a lot, and I've worked with actually a lot of school gardening programs, and what they have found really helpful to do, some of them have used our growing food curriculum or the food day lessons that I just talked about along with that, and I truthfully think the growing food curriculum, those kinds of topics work really well because it's actually then doing science topics that are about plants and what plants need and how plants develop and the interactions in nature, that they can be learning about those topics in their science class along with going to the garden. So it definitely makes some great direct connections from what they are doing in the classroom to the gardening experiences. And a lot of times the classroom teachers that I've worked with have really looked for that experience because they want the garden to be more than something that feels like it's just a fun time to get outside for the students, that it really is connecting to what they're doing in the curriculum. One school that I worked with that actually had challenge with the students doing writing, and they realized this was in New York City and most of the kids didn't really get out of their neighborhood too much, is that the garden actually gave the students all this really powerful and very common experience that they all had together and they all shared, and they ended up doing a lot of their writing about their experiences in the garden. So that actually, and this was elementary age students, and I've also seen it done at one school with middle school students, it ended up being a really powerful way to get the students to have something really tangible and exciting to be able to write about, and something that they could do peer editing with each other because they had all had that common experience. So I think there's lots of ways to connect to it, and there's lots of ways to connect gardening to math and math education and make math really practical as well.
Right, that's great. And you had some great lessons in your presentation. Do you have some ideas for sort of longer-term projects that you could do that sort of comes out of this the lessons that you talked about?
Sure. One thing that I think is a really nice thing to do is in the classroom to do an indoor compost bin. And we have some instructions on that, but you can also find it anywhere on the web. And basically that ends up being something that the students can really monitor over time. And, they kind of like having the worms in the classroom in order to do the composting and adding things to it, and to actually watch that process of watching the food scraps that they put in disappear and be broken down to this rich humus that then they can end up using to grow new plants. I've just found with all ages of children from kindergarten on up to be just such a powerful experience that it transforms for them over time. I've also worked with a lot of teachers who have done some long-term readings that have had to do with food or environmental sustainability and connecting it with food, that they'll have everybody read together and then talk about it and do projects that relate to what they are finding out. Another thing that a lot of the teachers I've worked with have done is to really try to do advocacy projects. And so once the students learn about these kinds of issues, then they'll go into the stores around the school and they will actually ask the store owners to change the kinds of foods that are available, or move foods that are maybe the more sustainable, more healthy options to the front of the store, and the students will help then to promote those foods and really make it happen. Probably one of the best quotes from doing this with the class is, as we were trying to work with the store and doing this, and the store owner was having a little bit of challenges thinking, would this really work? Is a girl said, "Look, we're learning this stuff, and we believe that if everybody knew at least half of what we now know, they would make different choices, and we're going to make sure that they learn this along the way too." So I think, once the students kind of get this knowledge and talk about it and have time to actually develop it, it can really be a powerful experience.
That's great. That's a great story about the kids really getting out in the community and really connecting with other people in the community. I also love the worm composter idea, the indoor composting idea, and bringing worms in the classroom is pretty cool too. The other question, I'm just pulling up some questions here. Feel free, anybody who's online and listening, to please enter your question into the box. I have a question here just asking about some ideas for books or films that students could read or watch to help them learn about food system sustainability.
Sure. Well, this would obviously vary a lot depending on the age of the children, but for younger children, one of the books that I really love is Eric Carle's Pancakes. And if you're not familiar with that, basically the boy in the story wants to have pancakes, but first his mother has him go out and get the wheat and then go and thrash the wheat and make it into flour and then go and milk the cow to get the milk and then go to the chicken and get the egg and then mix it all together, and then he wants to have strawberry jam at the top and he goes and gets the jam that they have made. And so it really ends up showing the different ways that the food system works together. And then for older children, there's obviously been lots and lots of documentaries that have been out about food, and I think a lot of them can work really well. Many of them actually have a curriculum online that goes with them. The film Nourish has that. Food Inc., I think, has some curriculum pieces that go with it as well. There's another great film that's called Fresh that is really about good farming practices that are going on, and it's very inspirational. Even things like Fast Food Nation, and there's a children's version of that. There's also a children's version of Super Size Me if you wanted to focus more on fast food and the implications of that. So I think that there's lots of different great ideas that people could look to get some ideas for things to do with their classroom.
Right, those are some great suggestions, some of which I'll mention have been reviewed in Green Teacher. So excellent. And are there other food, you mentioned obviously your own or the Life curriculum series you developed. Are there other food systems curriculum that you would recommend?
There's one by the Food Project that is out of Boston called French Fries in the Food System. That is a great curriculum and has lots of great ideas. There's another one, hang on, I think I might have it right here, and I just want to make sure I get the name right. There's Math in the Garden that actually has lots of math ideas for things that you could do in the garden with children. Going back to composting, there's Worms Eat My Garbage that is all about composting, and then there's Worms Eat Our Garbage that has lots of classroom activities that are related to food and eating different foods. National Gardening Association, which does happen to be the publisher of the Life curriculum, but actually has tons of great resources, some that they develop themselves, some that they just sell, but I think, and they are not, nonprofits, so truthfully, everything is really pretty reasonably priced. Their Grow Lab curriculum is a great curriculum for doing growing in the classroom. If you want to, you can't grow outside and you want to grow things in the classroom and learn about that, that would be a great curriculum to go to.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm just pulling up some more questions here while you're talking and couldn't quite jump in right away. Pam, you mentioned Bill McKibben's book and his Rolling Stone article. Could you talk more about the connections between food systems and climate change specifically?
Sure. And if you read that book, there's a few different things that are talked about in that book. One is obviously the types of energy that we use we need to change, and that is for all sources. But obviously our food system, the way that it is right now, is very, very energy intensive. So we really would want to be looking for different alternatives to how we actually get energy for getting into our food system. And then the second recommendation he has in that book is to think about our actions, and one of the biggest ones is our food. And it kind of relates to some of the same things that we have talked about before, but really trying to think about the resources that are being used to create our food and trying to reduce them. We have a cooking classroom at Teachers College, and what we do with students there is explore the whole story of food. And some of it I have actually talked about it already today, but we first talk all about how can we use fewer resources when we're producing our food. And obviously more organic growing methods, more sustainable growing methods end up having fewer inputs that are being put into our food as we are growing our food. And then, as I talked about before, thinking about how far we are transporting our food, and not only how far we are transporting it, but also how we are transporting our food. One very stunning statistic to me is since I live in New York City, and the only time we can really get strawberries is the main time is in June, and now there's some varieties of strawberries that grow over the summer, but any other fresh strawberries that we have in New York are coming in from someplace else, and most of the time it's coming from California. To fly a 5-calorie strawberry from California to New York City in an airplane, and they have to be flown to keep them fresh, takes 400 in a full plane full of strawberries. Each strawberry is using 435 calories worth of energy. So to fly a 5-calorie strawberry, we are using 435 calories worth of energy from fossil fuels. So thinking about both the distance our food is transported, but also how we are transporting our food, and trying to get things that we can transport in ways that that are using fewer resources. So boats and trains tend to use fewer resources. Planes use the most, obviously, and trucks are kind of somewhere in the middle. And then, as I mentioned a little bit before, is really thinking about how much we're processing our food. And once we start to think about this, and that's where the food day graphs, I think, come in, is it's really amazing when you just start to think, all right, I want to try to eat foods that are as close to how they came from nature as possible. And I know that it puts a different twist on things, and that certainly uses a lot fewer foods. And that is talked about. This question came from the Bill McKibben book. It's talked about in that book is all along the way in our food system. Try to think about the resources that are used and try to figure out how you can end up reducing those resources as the food is moving through the system. Clearly, making the system shorter is also uses fewer resources. Another way that I've used that food system mapping activity that I talked about before is to have some students do a food that they can go and see at the farmer's market. So, for example, do strawberry jam that you get from the farmer's market. And you can even go and talk to the farmer about, where were the strawberries grown? What did they do to make the jam? And then compare that to a strawberry jam that you might get in the store that is coming from a larger company. And very quickly, the students start to realize that the number of steps and the types of things that happen in the step is really different for the food that is produced more by, a more local food system versus a much more industrialized national or international food system. And so they get right away, how much resources are being used as they are producing the food.
Right. You might say not all strawberry jams are created equal.
That's right.
So and wow, that's a heck of a stat about strawberries and the way they're flown and the amount of resources they use. So I think that's one of the really good things. One of the things I really liked about your presentation about that curriculum is the way you sort of, you let the students fill in the blanks between the sort of whole food, the original version of the food, and the processed version. And I think there's a lot of room for that climate change conversation to happen in between. So I have just a couple more questions, and I think we're going to wrap it up here. I did have Barb ask a couple of questions, one of which I think you kind of already answered a bit, Pam, which was if you had any farm-to-table curriculum recommendations. And the other question was, do you have a food miles calculator you can recommend?
I know that there was I thought it was out of Iowa somewhere, and I don't know if it was the Leopold Center in Iowa, but there was someone that had a good food mile calculator online. A farm-to-table curriculum, I think the one that I mentioned before, the French fries in the food system, along with ours, I think has a lot of good activities that are along that part of the curriculum. Truthfully, when we were developing our curriculum initially, which we started a while ago, we looked at what was out there, and there was a lot on food production and gardening, and obviously there's a whole lot of curricula about, nutrition and basically, as we like to describe it in our program, what happens to food after it gets into our body. What we really realized is that there was very little that was kind of connecting from farm to table. And I don't know, if anybody knows of anything, if you could pass it on to me, that would be great. I don't know of that many other ones that are out there that are really about investigating our food system.
Okay, I think that's a good answer. One more question I had in here, and then I think what we'll do is move on to, I'll pull up the questionnaire for people at the end of the survey, and we'll sort of wrap things up. I had a question about whether you're aware of schools that both grow and cook foods as part of their food system studies.
Well, if you're familiar with the edible schoolyard model that started by Alice Waters out in Berkeley, California, they have that is exactly what they do. They have a kitchen classroom along with a gardening curriculum, and I think that the connections of those can be very powerful. There are several edible schoolyards around the country, and New York now has an edible schoolyard model, so it's actually in one public school out in Grays and Brooklyn, which is really far out in Brooklyn, and they have a beautiful quarter-acre garden and then a kitchen classroom. And the students in that model, the students all go to the garden twice a month, but they actually try to make it not 2 weeks apart, so it's kind of evenly spaced, but actually they go twice within a couple of days of each other. And what they have found is, even though then it means that there's a longer time between when they go back, getting those two experiences in a row and getting to kind of continue something in the garden actually really enriches the garden experience. What they do with the kitchen classroom there is that every student goes once a month to the kitchen classroom, but they do it half a class at a time. That way then it is only about 10 to 15, depending on the size of the class, 10 to 15-ish students in the kitchen. And they really then get to do lots of hands-on cooking. They try to, as much as possible, grow a lot of the foods that are growing in the garden, so it's definitely very seasonal cooking, and then talk about how the students can apply that in their lives. And we actually are working with them now to try to evaluate that model and figure out, what is the interaction and how is it changing students even more when they have that gardening and cooking experience in complement with each other.
Right. That sounds like a great program. That's excellent. I know I've done a bit of volunteer work here in Toronto with an organization called Evergreen that has a teaching kitchen and also has a small garden and that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of, obviously that kind of thing is growing all the time. So I think what we'll do. Sorry.
No, I just think that the more that children can get these connections, the more it really does change, and especially now it can be so challenging with the food environment that we are all living in, that the more that students can get these connections with real food, I do think the more powerful it is for having them make changes and really get it all and apply it in their lives.
Great. Thank you very much, Pam. I think we're going to wrap things up. I've already put the questionnaire on the screen, and actually I can already see people have started to respond, so that's great. I hope it didn't disappear for people. I'll try to bring it back up. Maybe if you're still on the line there. Before we go, is there anything that we've missed, you think, Pam, or any closing remarks you'd like to say to folks?
Thank you for coming, and I apologize again for the technical challenges that we had at the beginning, but if anyone wants to be in touch and has any other questions or anything, please feel free to be in touch with me.
Great. Thank you, Pam, and thanks to everyone for listening. We will be sending out a follow-up email after this presentation to everybody who registered with some contact information and maybe some links to some of the curricula and other things that Pam mentioned during the webinar, or we can maybe enter her email or info. Maybe I'll enter that into the chat box in just a minute. If you have any particular questions, you can also email info@greenteacher.com. and you can speak to myself or Tim, and we can sort of forward that information on. But like I said, we'll be following up with an email if you had registered via the Eventbrite site. Just a reminder that we have another webinar coming up tomorrow evening, as well as a number of other webinars you can find on our website at greenteacher.com, and as well as our many, many archived webinars. So thanks very much for joining us tonight. Feel free, in fact, we encourage you to fill out the questionnaire that's on your screen right now, and have a very good night, everybody. And in case I didn't do so already, thank you very much, Pam, for your presentation.
You're welcome.